Hello, you're watching Dukascopy TV and welcome to another Hollenbeck Unleashed. Of course, joining me in the studio is Dr. Frank Hollenbeck of the University of Geneva. Dr. Frank, welcome back.
I enjoy being here.
Now, we're talking about France and Greece today. Manuel Valls, the new French Prime Minister, has declared that he will decrease corporate tax and as well as other taxes. He's also said that he wants to decrease public expenditure by 50 billion euros, 2.5% of GDP over the next 3 years. Is this the right step for France and for Mr. Valls?
Well, it's the right step. It's just relatively too little. Okay, if you look at what's been going on in the case of France, we can see that public expenditures have basically continuously increased since 2007. But the key thing is that the tax burden has actually increased significantly. It's gone from 43.4% to actually 46.2%. And what we've seen in France is we've seen a 16% increase in taxes in 2011, a 19% increase in taxes in 2012, and a 22% increase in taxes in 2013. And the thing is about increasing taxes is the French government assumes that by increasing tax rates is going to be able to increase tax revenues. And I've talked about this before, which is called the Laffer curve. Okay, there's a certain point where raising taxes actually is counterproductive. It actually reduces your tax revenues. Okay, for example, if you're a star player on Paris Saint-Germain, okay, and you're earning $1 million, okay, and I impose a 75% tax, it's very possible that you'll pay that tax this year. Okay, but next year you'll be playing maybe in England or in Spain or in Italy, and let me ask you, what is 75% of zero?
Well, zero.
It's zero. In other words, what we have is we may have an ability to raise tax revenues, okay, short term, but long term what happens is increasing tax rates is actually counterproductive, okay? And what we can basically say is it's very likely that once you go over 30%, in other words, once the tax burden is over 30%, in the case of France it's 46%, that any tax increase is actually going to reduce tax revenues.
Now, what about this Prime Minister? I mean, you know, Mr. Valls is relatively inexperienced. One UK news story was that he could be the new Tony Blair of France, which is shocking. But, you know, he wants to reduce public expenditure by 50 billion euros. You'd say that's easy for this Prime Minister?
Well, the advantage he has is he doesn't have a lot of baggage. And what we know from history is it's actually socialist governments that have been able to implement market-oriented reforms. If you take the case of David Lang in New Zealand or Gerhard Schröder in Germany, they were able to implement market-oriented reforms. And the reason they were able to do that is because they were able to negotiate with the labor unions, something a right-wing government would not be able to do. Now, it is true that the problem we have in France is we have a bloated public sector and we have a tax burden that's significantly increased. But there are other problems in France. One of them has to do with what is called legislative inflation. And in the case of France, we have 40,000 regulations, we have 22,000 sections of an act, and we have 137,000 decrees, okay? And as we can see from this graph, between 2003 and 2013, we've just had a continuous increase in the amount of regulations and codes and basically regulatory restraints on entrepreneurs and small businesses. So it's made it much more difficult to produce goods and services in France. It's basically what Montesquieu said. It's that useless laws weaken necessary laws. Okay, and I talked about this in this article, which is To Save Europe, Free the Market. And in this article, I talked about how land use laws in France since 1960s have become more and more restrictive, okay, to the point where you can basically not build anywhere in France. And we have to recognize that housing is an important sector of the economy, okay. It's because of these land use laws, basically, why we have, agricultural land outside Geneva, okay. In other words, we rather see beets being raised on land, okay, where farmers pour tons of chemical on it, than having apartment buildings being built that would house that are great need by the French middle class.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another country in Europe I must push you on, Frank, here is Greece. Greece has sort of been sliding out in and out of the headlines, but it's been quite quiet of late. And do you think that now there's talk of growth picking up in Europe, is the worst definitely behind us now in Europe, and as well for periphery countries like Greece?
Well, I think I've done interviews for the last 3 years, and every year in the spring we talk about growth picking up in Europe, and we're talking about growth picking up in Europe again. I think people should keep an eye on Greece. It's something that is kind of out of the headlines right now, but it's still relatively significant, okay? The European Commission just indicated that Greece won't be able to meet its targets and that it will probably need more money, okay? It's already been given 215 billion out of the 240 billion that's been allocated to it. We also have to recognize that Greece is going to be influenced by what's happening in Ukraine. People don't know that 75% of Greece's natural gas comes through the pipelines, through the Ukrainian pipelines, okay? And also, if we put restrictions on Russian travel, okay, a lot of Greek travel industry is dependent on, Russian visitors. So we could still see Greece create a financial crisis in Europe. I think it's very likely in the sense that they have a very fragile majority at the moment. And if the socialist government comes in, it's indicated that it would, I shouldn't call it socialist, I should call it a communist government comes in. They've already indicated that they would default on their debt. Okay, so people have to remember that out of 240 million, 50% has been guaranteed by Italy, Spain, and France. So we could still see a catastrophe in Europe, a financial catastrophe.
And do you think that Greece could still leave the euro, or do you think there's a greater chance of Germany doing that? Briefly.
I think ultimately there's going to be a clash between the southern countries and Germany on what the appropriate role of monetary policy should be. And if I was Germany, I would be planning today. If I was advising the German chancellor, if I was advising Merkel, I would be telling her make plans to possibly leave. Okay. I'd have at least something on the table.
Do you think we'll be talking about growth in Europe again this time next year? I
think next year let's be honest, we're not really talking a lot of growth. We're talking somewhere between 1% and 2%. Let's be honest, for Europe to get out of the mess it's in, it needs growth around 4 or 5%. Okay, and that's not going to happen with debt to GDP ratios in almost all European countries almost at 100%. That's just not going to happen. Okay, so we're just waiting for the next crisis in Europe. That's all we're doing.
We'll have to leave it there, Frank, and wait. Thank you very much for coming into the studio once again. That's all for the moment here on Dukascopy TV. Join us later. We'll continue to bring you interviews, and of course we'll start again fresh with further interviews and updates on Monday. But for now, from me, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.